Okay, our group today is going to be debating regulation and deregulation as two possible solutions for the current economic crisis. Jeff and I are going to be arguing that regulating a society is going to result in economic success, whereas Marlon's going to be arguing the opposite. In the past, there are historical examples of how a completely regulated society has been implemented, and we have seen the successes and drawbacks of that society. There are also examples of free market societies that have been implemented as well. What we are here to discuss is if it would be more efficient to choose one of the two methods, or if a solution would be to compromise and utilize a mixed economy. To start off, we're going to talk about the too big to fail policy and the effects of it on the economy. To give a little background on what this theory really is basically it states that certain companies are literally too big to fail in this current economic society. And if or when they do fail, it's going to be disastrous to the entire economy. Basically, it states that the wealth in the economy is not spread out evenly, and that some companies are larger than other companies in that sense, like financially. So what I believe is that the government needs to intervene and regulate this theory to allow for a fair marketplace, because without this government intervention, the gains and losses are not spread out evenly between companies.
Well, from my perspective, a truly free market perspective, the too big to fail policy really doesn't exist, because it counteracts the main principle of the free market perspective, which is no intervention or very little intervention from any outside body like the government or any other higher body. So when the government intervenes, it counteracts it. It basically takes away the main principle in which the free market perspective is built on.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you say this theory doesn't exist, but if you look at GM, for example, the reason why I argue this theory is not made up is because GM is a present-day example of a too-big-to-fail company. In 2008, even with such a low market value of $4.76 per share and no economic growth, GM was still alive, and they were still employing millions of jobs and providing financial services to, globally. Yeah. So given this, how does this theory not exist?
Well, that's because the government intervened and bought GM out. If GM would have failed in 2008 when their market value was extremely low, either they would have corrected themselves as a company or they would have failed. And if they would have failed, other companies such as Honda or Ford or Toyota would have bought GM out or picked up their business and would have expanded and learned from GM's mistakes. By the government intervening, no companies could really learn from their mistakes.
Right. I mean, we have to take into consideration that we're looking at the global economy, not just America. So the reason the government bailed out GM to begin with is because it would have affected the entire world and not just America solely. So for this reason, there would have been a global effect, which brings us to our next topic of comparing regulation and deregulation in Canada's economy, taking a closer look at that.
Right. So I believe in a more prominent government role in regulations, mainly on banks, and I believe that will allow for a fair and safer marketplace and the prevention of crises like the one that happened in 2008 globally. And one of the good places to look at that is Canada. Canada refused to change their economic regulations while the U.S. and Great Britain loosened their regulations up. So when they stuck to their strict regulation, in the long run that really helped them out, because right now they're considered one of the healthiest economies in the world, and they're also the first country since the global crisis in 2008 to raise interest rates. And while we lost millions of jobs in the U.S. during the crisis, they've only lost 400,000, and 3/4 of those jobs have already been recovered. So
right.
That's a good sign.
And not only are they one of the world's healthiest nations, but they're also one of the world's wealthiest nations. And currently, their GDP is growing 20% faster than that of the United States. And also, while they're enforcing this regulation, this strict regulation that Jeff is talking about, there were no mortgage meltdowns or subprime crises in Canada at that time.
Well, that's because Canada also, since they didn't regulate or loosen regulations, they didn't have the economic growth that America and other nations in the early 21st century had, because America's economic growth in the early 21st century surpassed Canada's by a lot, maybe double, in the growth of GDP. And actually, I have data from 2002 saying that the Fraser Institute and the Canadian government came to the American government asking how we experienced such high economic growth, and they wanted to model a system similar to ours. And I guess that really didn't work out for them because they kept their same regulations.
Right. So, well, currently, just this year. President Obama has been quoted saying that the United States should take note of Canada's banking system, and even Britain's Treasury chief is saying that we need to emulate some of the same ways that Canada's cutting their deficits. So maybe, I guess they're kind of they want to use, Canada's going to be able to use some of the U.S. policies along with their own.
Yeah.
And I think the U.S. should try to emulate that as well, because it's been helping Canada out.
Well, maybe it has, but other countries that never had high regulations, such as Hong Kong, never experienced the same amount of economic recession as we have either. It's more like a flaw within the system, not the marketplace. Because Canada's in 2005, Hong Kong's unemployment was only 3.6%, and in 2010, July 2010, it was only 4.2%, which is less than half of America's unemployment. So it's more of a problem within the system and who's running the system rather than the system itself.
Right. Okay, but our next topic is banking, and just this past year, there's at the G20 summit, which is where all the nation's foremost economic leaders meet. They devised an 8-year plan where they want to raise the common equity of banks. And common equity is capital that banks directly use to absorb economic loss, like during economic hardships.
Yeah.
And right now, the international banks only hold 2% of their common equity at all times, and the U.S. banks only hold 4% at all times. And what they want to do is they want to raise that to 7%. So when crises do happen, they can use that amount of common equity that they're holding to absorb those losses, instead of when they kept it at low percentages, people couldn't take out any loans because they didn't have the money on hand. Well, because banks were trying to make money instead of holding on to it and lending it out to the people that needed it.
Yeah, I think I read about that somewhere. Wasn't it an increase of about 3%?
Right, yeah. They want to increase it up to 7%, and most regular U.S. banks are at 4%, while the international ones are at 2%.
That, if you look at it, the increase of 3% from 4 to 7 is a significant amount once you get on a higher scale of about $1 trillion. And the world market is even larger. Once you take away from the loanable funds, that means there's less opportunity for money to grow and for people to invest in other areas. And by doing that, you may have a more stable marketplace, but you may never experience the economic growth that would have been experienced if the increase didn't happen. If you look at the plan, it seems like a big increase, a big jump.
Right. I mean, it is a big increase, but they're also allowing a pretty sufficient amount of time. And regulators want by 2019 to have like that 7%, and if they don't make it, then the regulators are just going to take that out of the earnings that the banks make.
And you have to, like you just said, you have to look at how it's going to be over a long period of time. It's not a short process at all. So it's going to be over. It was an 8-year plan. So take that into consideration. So
the main purpose of this is just to act as a safety net, because that's what we lacked during the 2008 crisis. We didn't have that safety net to just that safety, that more like pillow of money basically that banks could hold on to lend out to people that really needed it during times of hardship.
That's true also.
Okay, seeing or hearing the things that we're saying about banking and the G20 summit and how there's going to be, we're going to have economic success over an 8-year plan, and how that's going to be our safety net to reach economic stability.
Yeah.
We can see that, looking at these things such as the too big to fail theory and how the wealth in the economy is not spread out evenly at all, versus, and like having regulation to get to this fair marketplace and to allow even distributions of gains and losses throughout different companies. And then going into talk about, GM, for example, and then seeing Canada's economy specifically, and how when they had tight regulation in 2008, their economic success was, very high, and they did a lot better than the United States. So seeing all these examples, we can definitely see that, not only, we don't need to just have a strict regulation. We need to implement different policies.
Yeah.
Kind of like compromise and utilize a mixed economy using fair market or free market theories, and also utilizing regulation in societies.
Yeah.
So by looking at banking specifically, now we're going to go into more detail. In Catherine and Shom, we're going to talk about nationalizing and privatizing banks.